January 2024 Accounts Receivable Core Committee meeting. Hope you're all staying safe and warm in this prolonged cold. Should get through today's agenda pretty quick today. One with a fewer group and just the things that we have to on the agenda. My name is Gerald Floyd. I'm the statewide Accounts Receivable Management Coordinator, and glad to have everyone here today. Normally we would go around and do introductions, but in the virtual world that gets a little confusing. So we will include the attendees in the minutes that will be posted along with this recording on the Swarm website here in a few days. So first up on our agenda is the announcements for the Accounts Receivable Performance Measures Q2 data. Just a reminder that the reporting deadline is January 31st. So your October through December information for collections and accounts receivable outstanding are the sections that need to be completed. For agencies that are subject to the OAM, I want to clarify that. I know that it is sometimes confusing for folks when they see the minutes and they don't recognize that because their agency is not subject to that reporting. But if you are an OAM subject agency, that is a report that is required and should be familiar to you at this point. So just a reminder that January 31st is the deadline for Q2 submissions. Next up, we have, I guess it was late last summer, we asked agencies, or maybe it's closer to fall, we asked agencies to complete a survey to help us kind of put together what we call peer groups, so that when we evaluate the ARPM data, we can kind of see within those groups agencies that have similar functions, similar receivable types, collection tools, etc. And so we wanted to share at least the initial groupings based on agency responses. And then from this, how we will be using that information will be to take data from starting with FY22 and 23 and being able to kind of look at the various aspects of the ARPM reporting within these groupings. And one of the things that I will say as I've kind of started through this process is there is definitely a thing as too much information or too many variables. And so while this will be useful to us, it is certainly not going to be an end-all be-all determination of, where an agency should fit, because there are so many variances within what these different agencies will do, even within what would be defined as a common peer group. For example, and you should be seeing the Excel groupings here. The first one is the agencies under the administrative function of administration. And so you've got DAS, Blind Commission, Employment Relations Board, Library, Youth Authority, and Revenue. Obviously, there's a big swing in agencies there, both in size and volume of receivables. And so as we begin the process of looking at the FY22 and 23 data, while it will give us various insights, it's not necessarily something that I'm going to look at and say the Blind Commission should be collecting at the same rate as Department of Revenue because they're in the same peer group. There's other variables such as the type of receivable, primary customers, those types of things that it'll give us a starting point, but I'm not going to look at that information and say this agency should be performing better or that agency should be using the same collection methods as another agency within that same peer group. And so just wanted to start off by saying that this is a lot of information as I've started this process. And today I just wanted to kind of share with you the different groupings by function, receivable types, etc. So I'll kind of scroll down here a little bit. One of the other things that I found was in some cases, there's only a few agencies that had similar functions. And again, there can be considerable differences between those couple of agencies in what they do and the size of the receivables that they have. And so while looking at agency functions, for example, within advocacy, that is probably not an area that I'm going to start off and say, well, let's compare those two agencies just because of the volume and size of what they have. You know, in the types of receivables they have are different. So again, this is a starting point, not an ending point, but it is, you know, our next step will be to work with some of the agencies that we look at in here and say, well, I could see where you answered your agency function as X. However, you're kind of an outlier within that particular grouping. Why did you answer that way? Are you slotted correctly? So it's going to be, that'll be our next piece of this process, along with looking at the actual data for fiscal years 22 and 23 to be able to kind of use this information as, again, I mentioned when we started the survey, our intention is to be able to look within these various groups and find where there are agencies that have high performing, you know, collections, collection rates, smaller percentages of accounts that are becoming 90 days past due, and working to better understand what those agencies do and the processes that they have, and then looking at the opposite end of that spectrum to work with agencies that have similar functions, receivable types, etc., and helping them to identify if some of the work that is being done by the higher performing agency or higher rate agency, I should say, can be utilized within those agencies, so that we're kind of helping to bring up those that have the lower collection rates and higher rate of accounts becoming past due. It again is a conversation starter. It is not an expectation that you're going to implement something that another agency can do, because it's going to depend on what the authority of that agency is to perform that particular function, such as collection tools. The source of the garnishment needs to be determined as to whether or not, for example, garnishment is a collection tool available to the agency. In some cases, we may find out that the agency could follow certain steps within statute, such as taking a civil penalty and recording it with the county clerk lien record. That then gives them the authority to issue a garnishment. If the agency hasn't been doing that, it is something that they could begin to do as a way to increase their overall collection rate. But this, again, is a conversation starter to learn and try to assist agencies that are on the lower collection rate, higher delinquency rate spectrum, to try and get those areas to improve. So I'll scroll a little bit further here. Assistance, welfare, and benefits. Kind of had common agencies that I was expecting to see there. Education. Only a couple of agencies responding in that category. Grant funding kind of seems to be a little bit of a broad spectrum there in terms of the types of agencies involved. And I will say that if you look back at the survey, some folks were giving us their kind of if the category that we had provided didn't fit, we asked you to kind of tell us your interpretation of what that category was for your agency. And based on that, and sometimes I had to kind of combine, and judicial / justice services is one that I kind of combined just to be able to at least get a couple agencies in the same group here. But again, the idea of this was to at least look at some similar functionality, similar receivable types. So as we go through marketing, here again, you've got agency that does sales as a primary function with the lottery versus tourism commission that obviously doesn't have sales as a method of their income. So there's going to probably be some variations, even though all of their answers are similar or the same, I should say. The agencies themselves are going to still have some differences. Natural resources. This and public safety, again, areas that I was expecting to see particular agencies in. Policy oversight and training. I was kind of surprised that military ended up in this one, but I guess it kind of depends on the point of view of the person that was responding. I was kind of thinking that would have been a little more in a public safety category, but here again, this is the agency's responses. Regulatory licensing, again, another agency that has, or a category that has a number of agencies that fit into this. You know, obviously as a state agency, this is a common purpose of an agency is to provide regulatory oversight and licensing. So here again, this is just one grouping based on agency functions, and I've done the same thing with the receivable types. And I will share all of this in the spreadsheet in the minutes when they get sent around. So I'm sure some of you are looking for your agency and in what list they're categorized in, and who else is in that same grouping. So you'll be able to look at that when I send out the minutes. I just wanted to share this as kind of where our next step of this process is and where we're going with it. When I do reach out to some of the agencies, I will be looking at the again, FY22 versus 23, what information has changed, what agencies within that grouping, kind of stand out either in terms of collection rates or delinquency rates, and begin having those conversations around what's working well, what's not, and how do we help agencies improve based on the lessons learned from the agencies that have the higher rates. Any questions overall in terms of kind of how this is shaking out in terms of the groupings? Any observations that stand out to anyone? Just wanted to give a couple minutes to see if anybody had any questions on that. Hearing none. Again, I won't necessarily, go through and provide examples or read the list for all of the different agencies. Yeah, Ian.
So just, to summarize and clarify, so the agencies are going to reach out to other agencies within their peer group to set up a time to talk and kind of start working through a collaboration type exercise to see what's working, or this is going to be a facilitated thing.
So my plan is to that this would be a swarm effort, myself reaching out to the agencies that based on the data, again, looking at FY22 and 23, and which of the within these groupings are the high performing. I will be sort of interviewing them on what is the what are they doing, and what are their successes, and what are the tools that they're using, for example. And then using that information, I will reach out to the agencies again that are on the opposite end of that might be able to learn from those lessons on ways that they might be able to utilize some of the same tools or techniques, and ways that they phrase letters, things like that, to improve their processes. So it will be a facilitated process. Certainly, we do have our agency contacts. If when I send out the minutes, if before you see something, you say, hey, okay, I'm slotted in the same group as another agency, I think we probably are pretty similar. If you want to reach out to someone, that is certainly something that you're able to do. But in terms of the evaluation of within these groups, who's on the high end versus the low end, that's something that I'm still evaluating, and will be doing the reaching out and kind of documenting those lessons learned to then reach out within that same peer group to agencies on the other end.
Is your goal to try to get through some of this before year end, or this will go into the following year as well?
I would suspect that overall this is probably going to be a calendar year 24 effort. Just because this is along with other things that we have going on, such as the management report that's coming out at the end of the month, the ongoing ARPM receiving, preparing for fiscal year end, next year reporting, all of that. It's kind of fitting in among those other projects and ongoing work. So I don't see this as something that's going to be done in a matter of, the next few weeks or months. And hopefully the other piece of that is, as we go through and complete fiscal year 24, and we've got that data, we'll be able to use the same tools to evaluate, are we making progress going forward? Do we begin to see those improvements either quarterly, annually, et cetera, in the various areas of the reporting in the ARPM?
Thank you.
Yeah. So next up on our agenda, the fiscal year 23 LFO reporting summary. Since we did not have a November meeting, this is kind of our first chance to share with you kind of some of the information that we got out of the data from the LFO report. And what you see in this Word document here are some of the same tables that we have in our management report, again, that will be coming out at the end of the month. And within that, one of the first things that we do is we take the LFO data and we segment it by branch of government, primarily because things like the OAMs and the state policies are applicable typically to executive branch agencies. And so when we look at information, it's useful for us to kind of say what's really changing within the executive branch, while we're still able to take the overall LFO data and segment it out into the judicial, and others are things like the universities, some other like semi-independents are part of that, I believe, as well. But basically, this is kind of the first take of overall 3.5 billion ending balance. The doubtful accounts, as you know, in the reporting, what is estimated not to ever be collected. So this is to help the legislature kind of understand, while yes, there is 3.5 billion, kind of giving some historical context. It used to be when we had budgetary shortfalls, this was a common thing that legislators would look at and say, well, if we just go collect this money, then our budget problems will be over. So this helps provide a little bit of context that says really over half of what we have reported is doubtful to be collected, is still going through the process of the collection efforts. And you know, therefore they're still on the books. They don't meet criteria for write-off yet, things like that, but they are doubtful that they're going to be collected based on an agency's history, things that they're looking at that would help them make that assumption of what they believe is doubtful. So when you look at this, you know, one of the things that stands out to me, judicial, most of their accounts they view as doubtful. And when you look at the nature of the judgments for judicial being criminal cases, based on their collection history, that's probably to be expected that you would have a higher rate of doubtful accounts. You know, just that could be a demographics perspective, but as well as the historical actual collection rates, that's telling them that a large majority of these accounts are not going to be collected. I think when you look at the executive branch and even the others to a certain extent, it's certainly not as high of a ratio compared to their ending balance. I think executive branch in particular can probably evaluate that doubtful component even a little bit more with a little more scrutiny to say, is it really something that I expect to be collected? Versus, well, it's still a DOR, so I'm not going to report it as doubtful. You know, that doubtful is not we're going to hold you to that. It is a point in time, I believe, of that balance, this much is not going to be collected. Doesn't mean that you stop trying to collect. It just means at that point in time, at the end of the fiscal year, you don't think you're going to collect it based on, again, historical collection rates or the demographics of who you are collecting from. Those two things kind of go hand in hand often. So, you know, I think that's an area that we might look at doing some training. I know we talk about the doubtful should not exceed what's in your ACFR for doubtful. But I think there's also an opportunity to maybe record a little bit more as doubtful in both the ACFR as well as the LFO, if the agency looks at that information a little bit differently. The next section, based on branch of government, the accounts that are assigned to Department of Revenue. In the change there, executive branch did see an increase, while judicial branch did decrease. A lot of that had to do with, I believe there was a state court administrator order. It might have even come, you know, from higher up that basically removed certain court fees that were added to debts, and I think that had a big significant impact on you know, accounts that were at DOR, of course, because that was a retroactive executive order, not executive order, administrative order. So overall, you know, information was to be expected, similar with the assigned to private collection firms. For the executive branch, most of that is the Department of Revenue on the tax side. And so, and then for judicial, they, under their statutes, they were not subject to the centralization efforts. So the accounts are returned to them, and then they assign them to private collection firms. So here again, you saw a large return back to the agency. I believe the same reason as what the Department of Revenue data was showing. And then accounts exempt from assignment. So it helps us in this case to break out by branch of government and see where are the balances that are reported. And then within the executive branch, we include in our management report a comparison of the changes from fiscal year 22 to the 23 data. And here you can see we had an increase in additions, overall decrease in collections. Within the management report, we do kind of go into what are some of the primary reasons for this change, or the agencies that had the largest share of that change, is maybe a better way to say that. And so when that report comes out, you'll be able to see it's typically, one or two agencies, sometimes three, that had the most significant impact on an overall increase or decrease in any given category. And that's usually tied to a number of factors. Either it can be new programs, it can be changes in recognition within that agency on what meets a certain category. But we have reached out to agencies where we saw those changes and asked them for some information, and that is then summarized into the management report. So you'll be able to look at that when it comes out. And we'll definitely be sharing on our listserv once that link is posted on our website. So you'll be able to go and look at that at your leisure. So here again, executive branch, accounts assigned to Department of Revenue, overall saw an increase of 44, almost 45 million, with an increase in the assignments, and as well as the return to the originating agency. We are kind of at a point now where we're starting to see a few more accounts because of the implementation of centralization. Those accounts are coming through and ending up in that RWO status, and that would then reflect typically as an account that is returned to the originating agency, and then the agency would be reporting that in Section 2, often as a write-off, but not always the case. Signed to private collection firms, again, virtually all of this is the DOR tax program, because they send their accounts directly to a PCF, along with the DOR OAA accounts that have gone through its cycle for agencies under the centralization efforts, but those numbers are not reported here as assigned to private collection firms, but the agency is kind of now the primary contact for those private collection firms under the statewide price agreement. And then finally, we have the accounts that are exempt from assignment for the executive branch. Did see an increase here, both in numbers as well as a percentage of the overall L&D balance. There's a couple of overall, just the increase in balance for those agencies most impacted for exemptions were ones that typically had a higher exemption. I'll use employment as an example. They've had a significant increase in accounts outstanding, as well as the 90 days due from the pandemic efforts and the volume of federal funds and so forth, and other state programs that were added during the pandemic, and they're now catching up, if you will, on the fraud cases that were, or identification of cases that were fraud during that large increase in their overall activities. And that is an agency that does have a DAS exemption. And so you saw an overall increase just from that agency, for example. So there's often a correlation with bigger swings in volumes of accounts of being agencies that are also subject to more categories of exemption, whether it be child support under DOJ, the DOR having the statutory 1-year provision, employment having a DAS exemption, so on and so forth. So not unexpected, but definitely something that we'll keep an eye on as we look at the overall balance increase. You know, we had started to plateau and now seeing, you know, roughly about $170 million increase. You know, it's starting to tick back up a little bit, but again, when you look at the reasons why and what we've gone through in the last couple of years, you know, this is probably something that is going to be expected for at least a few more years until we work through all of those pandemic related events and receivables. So again, we just wanted to share this information with you, kind of see the highlights of what we were looking and evaluating for the management report. Again, nothing that was terribly unexpected. And again, we did reach out to the agencies where we saw the largest volume to assist us in the drafting of that management report that's being reviewed by management at the current moment. And, you know, again, we expect to have that published by the end of the month. So with that, come back to our agenda here. Does anybody have any questions on that LFO reporting data before we go to the next agenda item? Hearing none. Does anyone have any topics, questions, anything they want to share for roundtable? Not hearing any. Last chance. Okay, well, the next Accounts Receivable Core Committee meeting will be on March 19th at 2 p.m. So I will send out the minutes to this as soon as I get them drafted, along with the link to the recording. It usually takes us a couple days, and given everybody catching up from weather and so forth, it might even be early next week before we're able to get that to the YouTube format to be able to post that link. So, but we'll definitely share the minutes and link on the listserv. Heidi, you had a question?
Yeah, I was wondering if you have any expectation if LFO is going to be changing this year, like new subjects that you want covered?
I have not heard of anything new from LFO. You know, I know they made their kind of round of changes. What was that, about 3 years ago? Where they added some new fields of reporting. I have not heard of that. I know they've kind of had a couple different folks involved since then that do the actual LFO report to the legislature. And the folks that I've been working with over the last few years, there has not been any indication that there's new information. I think some of the changes that occurred roughly 3 years ago were driven partially by that analyst's involvement with some of the budget meetings where there were a lot of questions that had come up, typically from Representative Gomberg on agencies' accounts receivables. And this was, LFO was kind of asked for some additional information. That was their way of saying, well, we'll begin to collect this information so we can answer those questions for you. And again, a lot of those questions do typically come or a little more scrutiny from different representatives during those periods of budget shortfall. And fortunately, we haven't had that for a while.
Another meeting?
Go ahead. Oh, sorry. So I'm not expecting any new requirements from LFO, or I should say I've not heard of any at this point. As soon as I do, we will certainly use, our listserv and as well as future ARC topics to share that information with you as soon as we know.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And
Any
Joe,
other?
this is Angelique. I did have one other quick question before we go.
Sure.
I was just wondering, while we've got other agencies out here, if there's any other agencies that have like an automated accounts receivable system or a process out there that's working well for them for that, well, that's also not very complicated. We just because we have accounts receivable at education that really is not, we don't have a lot of them, but wanting to look at what might be options to automate our process a little bit more. And so if there's another agency out there that might have something that's working well for them that they would be willing to talk with us about, I would love to hear what's working well for people. I know we've already talked with one agency, but looking for any good ideas out there that someone might have, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel if possible.
Absolutely. And I know I've been asked this, and I think there's a couple of factors here. One is like you mentioned, the complication, or complexity of a system, and how much does it integrate, between what the agency's function is versus what you're trying to get for an accounts receivable purpose. That's usually where a lot of those systems do end up becoming a one-off. I know employment's currently in the process of doing a system redevelopment. The vendor there is the same one that does the Gentax system for DOR. So it's a pretty integrated, pretty complex system. Probably not what you're looking for in this case, I would suspect. I know DCBS is kind of beginning the process of putting it out an RFI for different receivable systems, but they've got so many different programs that they're trying to integrate data in, get it consistent. But yes, if there's anybody on today that wants to speak up, but I'll definitely include it in the minutes and ask agencies to reach out to you.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Anybody off the top of their head have something they want to mention that they use that works well for them? All right. Well, certainly, again, in the minutes, I'll ask agencies to reach out to Angelique, and hopefully that they'll point them in a direction that will give them some assistance. Again, our next meeting will be March 19th at 2 p.m. Unless anybody has any other last minute questions that you'd want to have, we will be adjourned for the day. Thanks, everyone.